to the What Really Happened radio show. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Wednesday, April 29th, 2015, almost to the end of the month here. And we have a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, let's head on down to Baltimore and take a look at what's going on down there. Last night was the beginning of a curfew from 10 o'clock at night until 5 o'clock in the morning. The curfew seems to have tamped the violence down some, but not all. There was continued property damage. 10 people were arrested for violations of the curfew. And the Baltimore police are out there crediting the curfew for reducing the degree of violence and basically saying it's working. The city is stable. We would like to keep it that way. So I don't know what they're talking about, making the curfew permanent. From now on in Baltimore, you will be off the streets between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. And it wouldn't be the first time cities have had permanent curfews, especially for young people. During the height of the militant feminist movement in the 1990s, in the city of Davis, California, which was the victim of one of the most egregious of the rape hoaxes, just before the hoax was exposed, the city council was getting ready to pass a male-only curfew. So these things do happen. Now, I got some email. Apparently, the city of Salisbury in Maryland is calling for early store closings tonight. Apparently, on Monday, there was a peaceful protest march that basically originated from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, about 100 miles from Baltimore, and basically blocked the major north-south route from Wilmington through Salisbury to Norfolk, US 13, and backed up the traffic. So now the city of Salisbury is saying, well, let's just be careful, and we're going to close early. I'm seeing rumors of the demonstration in Chicago going violent, but I haven't found a confirmation on that just yet. Now, more and more people are looking at this. A lot of people are trying to take advantage of it for political reasons, whatever their agenda is. But I'm looking at a story in The Week, basically saying Baltimore and America's double standard on violence. And it's basically chastising the corporate media for the spin of portraying all of these protesters as thugs and violent people, not worthy of consideration, while basically writing the police departments a free pass for all this police brutality and murder of innocent Americans we have been seeing for years now. Now, I'm personally very glad the violence in Baltimore appears to be declining and has not been echoed in other cities. That being said, we should never forget the people of Baltimore, and indeed all of the United States, have a legitimate concern about the out-of-control police brutality committed by police of all colors against Americans of all colors. Now, Hillary is already out there grandstanding this incident, making a speech that we have to build a bond of trust and respect between the people and the police. But trust has to be earned. It cannot be demanded. And respect is a two-way street. Before we will respect the police must prove they respect the American citizens and, in particular, our rights under the Constitution. That has to happen before we will start trusting and respecting the police again. And it will be a long process. It's not going to happen overnight, and nobody should expect it to happen overnight. Another article over an SHTF plan pointing out more and more indications that there were professional protesters hired and brought in to crank up the violence or the illusion of violence in Baltimore. And apparently the same people were used in Ferguson. And we know there are companies who will do that. Rent a ruckus, where you can literally rent a mob of out-of-work actors and actresses to go on down and cheer a political speech or shout insults at an opposition candidate or policy. This is all part of public relations. They'll manufacture a crowd for the media cameras, and as soon as the cameras shut down, they're all off for their box lunch and home. Another article coming out of Prison Planet Soros Group advocating violence against cops in Baltimore. And the gist of the article that came out in The Atlantic was basically saying that nonviolence sounds really good, and yes, it worked for Martin Luther King, and yes, it worked for Gandhi, but really in this day and age, it's a futile tactic. It's never going to work. And so they're literally trying to crank up more violence for obvious political reasons. I don't think George Soros is personally worried about being wrongfully murdered by a police officer. So what interest does it serve to fan the civil unrest up? Well, it certainly justifies more draconian government intrusion into our lives. It certainly gives the candidates something to talk about in next year's election that isn't the economy and isn't the wars. But we're already seeing a lot of people are trying to manipulate this situation for their own personal political agenda, and we need to be very careful about that. Article that came out over at WorldNet Daily, just to show you how everybody's hopping on board this thing for whatever ink they can get, column inches, airtime, whatever. Psychologist. The president of the St. Louis Association of Black Psychologists, Dr. Marva Robinson, has come out saying Baltimore is suffering from battered community syndrome. And I'm sure somebody's already trying to come up with a pill for that one. But basically made a very telling comment. When post-traumatic stress disorder meets sick and tired, you get unmeasured rage. And that's really kind of a lot of what's going on all across the United States of America. We have been pushed to the brink, and we need to acknowledge that and understand it. That's why I was saying just yesterday, if this is a staged incident to try and bring about a national emergency or some other agenda, and they kick up violent riots in several cities, they could trigger a mass uprising of the American people that would be completely out of control. Now, one thing I am sick and tired of, and we've been seeing it all along. Every time the police murder another innocent American, they always immediately come out and say, oh, it was their fault. They deserved it. They didn't do what we tell them. They were holding this. They were holding that. Or there was some kind of a medical fault with the person that resulted in their death, and we are completely blameless. It's almost become a ritual when a taser kills somebody. The police will always say, obviously there was an unknown medical problem with the person. No, it isn't. When that 30,000-volt jolt hits the heart at the exact right moment in the beat sequence, the heart will go into fibrillation. We've had a cardiac expert on the show talking about that. Tasers are not non-lethal. They're lethal only a small percentage of the time, but they are still lethal, and people die from them. And it's not because they are frail human beings. It's because if that electric shock hits your heart at the right moment, the heart quits. So now the police in Baltimore are out there trying to excuse what happened to Freddie Gray by pointing out that he'd recently had spinal surgery. He'd been in a car accident. He was getting a structured settlement. Oh, see, he had a medical problem. Well, you know, if you are a police officer arresting somebody, you say, are you pregnant? Do you have a medical issue? And you make adjustments to that. You don't just grab a guy who's just had surgery, throw him in a van, and take him for a rough ride, which is exactly what happened. And they're trying to duck the blame by saying, oh, he had a problem. It was his problem. We didn't do anything wrong. There's always an excuse coming from the police why it is not their fault when Americans are dying in their custody. And it has to stop. If this guy had a medical issue, they should have been more careful with him. And coming out with this blame the victim tactic right now is not improving the situation on the ground in Baltimore. People are getting more and more angry at this arrogance by the police forces. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Baltimore, and frankly, for all the talk going out on the media about wanting to calm things down, the city of Baltimore itself is making a lot of mistakes. Now, earlier I mentioned all this talk about outside agitators being brought in, and the Baltimore authorities are seizing that to try and say that really there's no legitimate reason for the people of Baltimore to be upset with the police. It's all being brought by these outside agitators, and the police have done nothing wrong, and we're innocent victims in all of this. No, actually, the reality is that the police of the United States of America are murdering a lot of innocent Americans. And they're hiding their guilt behind very bogus stories. This latest one with the severed spine is just, it is the latest incident. It's not the only one. A lot of people have died under mysterious circumstances while in custody of the Baltimore police. And they're playing politics here with the corporate media to make it look like the police are just a swell bunch of Joes, and we should never, ever doubt that they have our best interests in heart. And all those people across America who are angry at the wrongful murder of their families and friends, that they're just a bunch of wide-eyed conspiracy kooks and you shouldn't pay attention to them. Now then, apparently, Baltimore has temporarily at least suspended the writ of habeas corpus. They now have a 24-hour detention without charge in place for anybody who's arrested while protesting. They can arrest you without cause, throw you in jail for an entire day. Your family won't be able to find you. And get this, bail bonds for those who are arrested and released are being set at $500,000. Do you think the people of Baltimore can afford a $500,000 bail? Of course not. Needless to say, the public defenders in Baltimore are absolutely up to their eyes in these cases getting ready. Now then, here's a story out of Mad World News. Baltimore business owners are taking matters into their own hands. And they're basically showing a lot of these business owners who are standing guard over their own businesses to protect them from vandalism and looting, because the police are not doing that. The police are basically kicking back. And this is another reason why we should all be supporting the Second Amendment, because those business owners have a right to defend their businesses against criminal activity and not be forced to be dependent on a police force that isn't there. We went through this out in Southern California during the Rodney King riots. When the riots started up, the LAPD ran like heck. And law-abiding business owners ran down to the gun stores and were hit with the 2-week waiting period, in effect. Of course, the looters, they were just breaking into sporting goods stores and gun stores and helping themselves. Now, apparently, the Walmart in Baltimore has suspended all ammunition sales, and this, too, is a repeat of a mistake that was made in Los Angeles in the Rodney King riot. The L.A. City Council banned ammunition sales within Los Angeles County so that law-abiding homeowners and citizens were not able to buy ammunition, but, of course, the rioters and looters were simply stealing what they needed. And the results showed it. Now, the big news on Fox about what's going on in Baltimore is the tragedy, the horror that the Baltimore Orioles will be playing the White Sox game in a stadium with no paying audience whatsoever. How horrible that must be. So, anyway. Other protests across the country we're talking about in Los Angeles, in Chicago, New Jersey. Apparently the Port of Oakland will be shut down Friday as a protest against all police violence, not just what happened in Baltimore. Because remember, Oakland saw a huge amount of police brutality during the Occupy demonstration. What's really ironic is the current chief of police in Baltimore used to be the chief of police in Oakland. Now, a Canadian reporter with the CBC, Neil MacDonald, is a white guy, and in his commenting about what's going on here in the United States of America, he says the police killings are America's real state of emergency, and even though he's white, he's afraid of the American police departments, because they are killing just as many, if not more, white people than black. The black deaths get the media attention for political reasons. The white deaths hardly get mentioned anymore, and yet the study conducted in Washington State showed that because of the negative media attention on the killing of black people, America's police departments are 25 times more likely to pull the trigger on a white suspect than a black one. All right, getting on down to Yemen, the situation there is really deteriorating. Iran was attempting to fly some humanitarian aid into Yemen, aircraft with food, medical supplies, And in order to prevent the humanitarian aid from reaching the starving Yemen people, Saudi Arabia bombed the airport, forcing the planes to divert. And how does this make Saudi Arabia look? Doesn't make them look like they're the good guys. And they've got all kinds of excuses. Well, there was a paperwork thing. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. But the U.S. Navy turned away the Iranian cargo ships with humanitarian aid. Saudi Arabia literally bombed an airport to prevent an Iranian aid plane from landing. Who's looking like the victim? Who is looking like the brutal oppressor in this story? Now, up in Ukraine, their right sector, the Ukrainian nationalist political movement, are planning to mount new protests against President Poroshenko. In fact, by now it's probably underway around Poroshenko's presidential palace. Speaking of Ukraine, the U.S. forces on the ground are off to a great start. 4 U.S. soldiers have been arrested for raping 2 young girls, aged 12 and 13 years old. I think this comes under the category of winning their hearts and minds. So we're off to a great start in that situation. Now, there was a very good story over at LiveLeak, The Horrors of Wall Street's New Libya. And it's basically saying, setting aside all the propaganda about bringing them democracy and saving them from an evil dictator, the reality is quite different. Prior to the invasion of Libya, to get rid of that pesky gold dinar, Libya had the highest life expectancy in Africa. And the government of Muammar Gaddafi had developed and nationalized oil resources. Every Libyan had a guaranteed income based on the oil profits. Food and housing heavily subsidized, free education, free medical care. You don't get that in the United States. They were building this amazing irrigation system. They were greening up Libya. Now, after the intervention, the Libyan people are starving. Their infrastructure falling apart. They're enslaved to a private central bank. This is the true result of the U.S. interventions to destroy healthy, happy countries around the world and reduce them to squalor to feed the greed of the money junkies. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. I know we've got 2 callers waiting on the line. I'm going to get to you in just a minute, but I want to hit this story. This apparently is just now breaking in the French media. No mention in the American corporate media, but according to the website FrenchIRib.ir, the French language version of the Iranian news feed, 2 Israeli warships have violated Lebanon's territorial waters, and in addition, Israeli drones were spotted over Beirut and the north of that country. Now, we know that Israel's last invasion of Lebanon failed to achieve their primary goal, which was to take control of the Litani River and divert that water down to Israel. And over the last couple of weeks, we've been getting all this wagging of Holocaust and Hitler and Nazis and all this other stuff here to try and build political cover for Israel, which is usually an indicator that Israel's getting ready to start something nasty. And if this report is to be believed, Israel is apparently starting to make stink face over at Lebanon. Alrighty, we're going to grab a couple of phone calls here. Sal in Colorado, aloha, welcome to the show. Ow. What's up?
Aloha.
Okay, that was a little...
I want to talk about the police in Baltimore.
Yes.
I want to give you some court cases because the police are not part of the governmental system. They have no duty to protect anybody.
Yes.
First case is Bowers versus DeVito in 1982. It's 686 Fed Second 616. And it states in there, the Constitution is a charter of negative liberties, tells the state to let people alone, does not require the federal government or the state to provide services, even so elementary a service as maintaining law and order. The second case is in 1997, and it was California Court of Appeals, Souza versus the City of Antioch. And it states in there, hold on, I'm trying to find it. Here it is. Police officers have no affirmative statutory duty to do anything.
We've seen a lot of these cases. There was a very famous one out of Washington, D.C. regarding these women who were sharing a townhouse. And apparently two of them were upstairs, one woman was downstairs when some rapists broke in and started raping the downstairs woman. The women upstairs called 911. Police said, we'll get there. They never did. Finally, the noise downstairs stopped. The women thought the rapists had left. They came down. The rapists were still there, and they wound up basically being sexually abused for the entire night. The women sued the police for failing to protect them, and the case was thrown out of court because the police do not actually have any obligation to intervene and protect you in the case of a violent crime. One of the reasons the police started using encrypted police radios was that people with scanners were starting to hear the police outside someplace where somebody was being murdered or beaten to death or raped or whatever, and the police were saying, do you think they're gone yet? Do you think they're gone yet? Is it safe for us to go on in? And so we've seen these cases time and time again, and it leaves us with the question that if the police are not actually there to protect us from violent crime, why are they there at all?
They are private entities. They're there to protect the political system.
They're there to collect the money. And one of the things that we noticed here in Hawaii is we used to have standalone police stations. Now all the regional police precincts are in the shopping malls. I mean, that tells you right there what they're really there to protect. They're there to protect the Nike sneakers and the DVDs and the Blu-rays from shoplifters. And obviously, if they're located in a shopping mall, they are not ideally located to deal with a home invasion or a mugging or a rape or a robbery. They're there to protect the money.
Yeah. There's another court case. It was an administrative hearing done by Rodney Class, who is a private attorney general in North Carolina. And the decision that came back said, thus, Dallas Police Department, that's the county, as a local unit of government is not an agency under Chapter 150B. Moreover, respondent's license plate agency is no longer is not an agency under Chapter 150B because it is a private entity and does not fall within the executive branch of state government.
Which gets even worse and worse when we find out that a lot of these police departments are being run by private contractors now. And, it's funny because, in our schools, they're still brainwashing the kids that the police are there to take care of them and protect them. And we know from real life that's not what's going on. Anyway, listen, Sal, thank you very much for the information. It's an ongoing problem. We're well aware of it. We're going to let you go and switch over to Matthew in Maryland. Aloha, Matthew. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Lots of stuff, Mr. Rivero.
Good.
First and foremost, I would say that, a lot of the stuff that you're seeing on the media, the coverage that's going on in the Baltimore situation is being blown way out of proportion. The first night of rioting was, obviously intense and pretty horrible. I live in a suburb right outside of the city. I don't live in the city, so I'll quantify that. But like last night's performance, and that's exactly what I'm calling it. It was a performance. The aerial footage, everything, the vast majority of people that were there right around the curfew when the police line advanced and the quote-unquote fireworks were thrown into the police lines and whatnot, the vast majority of the people in that crowd were media.
Yes.
And if you really pay attention to that footage, most of the people who were just kind of milling about and that obviously weren't media had left, or they were lingering so far in the background it was more or less the police advancing on the media. And the situation on the ground in Baltimore, I work in and around the city on a regular basis. It isn't as volatile as people make it out to be. There's of course a lot of National Guard. There's a lot of police from different counties and states floating around. They set up base camp in the Orioles stadium parking lot, which is always fun to ride by and see, National Guard and, Humvees and MRAPs and all this other good stuff, having themselves a good old time with their incident response vehicle monster thing. But realistically, I feel like, a lot of this is very much
Well, we already know. We already know the media is out there to sell the idea that the people who are protesting police brutality are wrong. The police are right. They're not really brutal. The spin is very, very obvious here. And again, I am very glad the violence seems to be tapering down and really wasn't all that great. I mean, I'm somebody who saw the Rodney King riots for real, and what I've been seeing in Baltimore is the violence is being committed by maybe 30, 40, 50 guys. And everybody else, the thousands of others, were being peaceful. But the media is out there to try and protect the police reputation and to dismiss the idea that ordinary American citizens have any legitimate reasons for unhappiness with our current political governmental system.
It's absolutely insane. Today, on some of the local radio stations, they, basically they're doing that whole, prop up the police, saying the police are the heroes and this, that, and the other. And I'm not saying some of them aren't, but the incident with it, and there's a lot of stuff going around in the media that's trying, and especially on social media, that is trying to demonize the Grays guy. That he had a horrible rap sheet. He was a drug dealer. He was already.
Yeah, I got 20 of those.
Blah, blah, blah.
I got 20 of those from different email addresses, all with the exact same text in there. It's a bought and paid for propaganda campaign. Matthew, do you want to sit through the commercial break?
Sure, absolutely.
All right, we're going to come back to you after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And before we go back to Matthew in Maryland here, I want to comment about one of the commercials you just heard about the importance of alkalinity, because the American diet is very acidic. And if your body has a low pH, it does lead to certain medical conditions. And I'm going to be very honest about my own health. I used to suffer from gout attacks, especially when I was heavier. And just by drinking high pH water, I don't have to deal with that anymore. So it really does. It is something that you need to be aware of. Big pharmaceuticals don't want you to know about it because they've got gout medications, pills, and shots that are very expensive. All righty, we're going to go back to the phone here. Matthew in Maryland, you had some more information for us about what's going on, and I'm in agreement that the corporate media is just spanning this up for political reasons, because they think it's going to improve their ratings, because they don't want to talk about other things that are going on, like Israel violating Lebanese territorial waters and airspace.
Well, because frankly, I wouldn't tune into them at any other time anyway, just simply because they have nothing worthwhile to say. But the thing is that just the fact that regardless of what Gray's history was, there's a narrative being put out here in this state, at least on the radio stations, that is basically trying to portray him as a previous criminal, this, that, and the other, and essentially take the onus of responsibility away from the police officers for what happened to him while he was in their custody.
Well, I want to make a point here, okay, because like I said, I got mass emailed this thing this morning, and I took a look through it, and all of those prior legal issues had been resolved. He had paid his debt to society, or he'd been found not guilty on them, and so he should be treated with the same respect and care any other citizen is when confronted by the police, and not given this rough ride, which very clearly is an abuse of our civil rights. For them, it's basically clandestine, covert police brutality is what they're doing. They call it a nickel ride in Philadelphia. In Baltimore, it's a rough ride. And by the way, another prisoner given a rough ride died in the custody of the Baltimore police, and he didn't have any prior medical issues to deal with. But you're absolutely right. They're out there trying to demonize the victim, in order to try and protect the reputation of the police. And the reputation of the American police, I agree, it is being tarnished by a small minority. But on the other hand, very clearly, our governmental structure is tolerating, if not encouraging this, especially with all this training by these Israeli security experts who are teaching the American police to treat us the way the IDF treats the Palestinians. So this is, in fact, this brutalization is a matter of policy. I do know a lot of police officers are not comfortable with this, okay? And they are not happy that their image of to protect and to serve is being basically thrown into the gutter by these more abusive compatriots of theirs. But they're going to have to live with this, because nobody is standing up to do anything about it.
Well, the problem is that it doesn't really matter what his criminal background was.
That's exactly, that's the point.
He should have never been treated in that manner. And they're also, another thing that's infuriating me is that they're using protesters like a dirty word.
Yes.
They're treating they're trying to make the act of protesting, so they're basically making the connection between protester and rioter. Like they're one of the same.
Oh, they're calling them all thugs here. In fact, there was this video on CNN where, one of the spokespeople for the protesters saying, you're calling us thugs. Why don't you just go ahead and use the N-word on us? I mean, it basically amounts to the same thing. And he's absolutely right. The corporate media is out there to demonize anybody who does not think the government is doing a swell job.
I don't know, Mr. Rivera. I think it's reaching a point of critical mass, and I hate to see it that way. I mean, I hate to say it that way or even think that. At some point, I don't know, what the breaking point is going to be. I pray that it doesn't ever happen. But at some point, I just can't see everyone, sitting down and taking this.
I hate to be this way, but that's actually my advice to everybody. It is very clear to me that our economic and political structure is in the process of self-destructing like the former Soviet Union did. And our best course of action is nonviolence, non-cooperation, because the last thing we want to do is give the government an excuse to declare martial law, a national emergency, and suspend what's left of our civil rights. And only a fool is going to fight a conflict the other side is already prepared to fight and win. So on a very practical level, we have to stay calm. And we just have to sit back, not get involved, not cooperate, not fill out the paperwork, not obey their little dictates about what we have to buy and not buy, and just sit back and let the system finish thrashing around in its death throes, because it's very clearly there. Thank you very much for the phone call, Matthew. I'm going to let you go. I got a bunch of stuff I got to get through here today. Over the break, Fox News was regurgitating this guy who landed a gyrocopter in Washington, D.C., and why he was allowed through, and on the radar it looked like a flock of birds, and that's their important news here, because they don't want to talk about anything else. Now, the damage has already been done. Harvard University just conducted a survey of 3,000 18 to 29-year-olds, and they came up with a lot of information. The one that leapt out to me is that in that demographic, 18 to 29-year-olds, only 2% trust the corporate media to do the right thing. So the corporate media has lost the war for the minds of America, especially the younger ones, who are unfortunately going to have to pay for our failures, unless we can derail this and head it on off. Now, getting on back to Israel, David Cameron is out there proving that just like Obama, just like John McCain, just like all these other politicians, he is Israel's minion. And he's out there in an interview with the British-based Jewish Chronicle that Tel Aviv had every right to defend itself from Gaza back last July, last summer's war. And he's saying, they've got to defend themselves. Well, what Cameron has forgotten, or at least he's hoping you have forgotten, is that Israel justified the attack into Gaza over 3 murdered Israeli teenagers who were killed in the West Bank. They weren't even in Gaza. Israel simply declared Hamas was responsible, even though the West Bank Israeli police said, no, there is no evidence to suggest that. So David Cameron is out there basically saying that Israel had a right to murder Gazans whenever they feel like under the flimsiest of pretexts. And I hope the British subjects are going to look at that and realize that this is not the kind of mentality they want running their country, especially because, like the U.S. Congress, David Cameron is running Great Britain on behalf of a foreign power. Britain is under puppet rule, just like the United States. We don't like it. The British shouldn't like it. The Iraqis didn't like it. The Iranians didn't like it. The Yemenites didn't like it. The Libyans didn't like it. Now, a video has surfaced showing Israeli soldiers attacking journalists near the Palestinian village of Nabi Salah, basically telling them to get out, stop taking pictures, stop reporting. We don't want this stuff to go on out. Another story here in Desert Peace. Vanunu still blowing his nuclear whistle. And they're talking about Mordecai Vanunu, who was literally sentenced to 18 years of solitary confinement for blowing the whistle on the fact that Israel is still building nuclear weapons in an underground factory underneath the reactor complex at Dimona. And he documented it with photographs. They were put out there. They were ignored by the American corporate media. And even though he has served his sentence, he is still under severe restrictions in Israel. He's not allowed to leave Israel. And apparently he's being spied on because he was spotted having a conversation with some foreigners for about a half an hour. They don't even know what he was saying, but immediately they arrested him, took him away, said, "What were you talking to them about? What were you..." The news information about Dimona is 30 years old. He doesn't have anything new to tell anybody that's not already out there. This is just Israel being spiteful and vindictive again. And, of course, all of this is very embarrassing for the United States government, which continues to take your money and give it to Israel, even though it's illegal under U.S. law, under the Symington Amendment to the Foreign Appropriations Act, under the GLAN Act. The U.S. government cannot give your money to any nation with nuclear weapons technology that refuses to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and refuses IAEA inspections. So the official U.S. government policy is still, we're not really sure, which I think makes the U.S. government look incredibly stupid. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open. 877-300-7645. 877-300-7645. Apparently, there is a major protest against police brutality starting to assemble in New York in Times Square. And the New Yorkers, like the people of Baltimore, like the people of the rest of the country, do have a legitimate gripe there. Remember that shootout at the Empire State Building? 8 bystanders shot, all by the NYPD. And now, of course, the government wants to say that we're not allowed to own bulletproof vests. You will stand there and be shot by the police like a loyal American citizen is supposed to, apparently. All righty. Again, more sources coming out saying that the mayor of Baltimore told the police to stand down and let the riots get going because the media needed pictures of burning buildings and property damage with which to demonize the protests. Now, I want to go back to a story we heard on the SRN Newsbreak about Corinthian colleges, where they have now closed their remaining campuses, and there are now 16,000 students who are basically close to graduation who are cut off, apparently, from their own transcripts. But here's the interesting part. Last summer, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who is now angling to be president, intervened at the U.S. Department of Education by allow Corinthian College to go on getting millions of dollars in federal financial aid while it was under investigation. And apparently what the Corinthian College has been fined for was confirmed cases of misrepresentation of job placement rates for their graduates. And we know that this is hardly confined to Corinthian. It's a big reason we have this gigantic student loan problem, because colleges will recruit students saying, our graduates are going out there in the industry and they've got high-paying jobs and you'll get a high-paying job and you'll pay these loans off in no time. And these kids go deeply into debt to the money junkies. They graduate college. There are no jobs because all the jobs requiring college degrees have pretty much drifted to other countries. And now they can't make the payments, and there's a gigantic student loan bubble that is getting ready to burst because Wall Street didn't learn anything from the implosion of the mortgage-backed security bubble in 2008. Why didn't they learn anything? They didn't have to pay for it. You did. So they're just going to keep on bubbling and bursting because that's how the really big fortunes are made in this country. Forget about this idea of inventing a new product and getting rich that way. That takes way too long. We'll just bubble this up. We'll ride it to the top, sell out, let everybody else pay the costs. That's the new model of American business. Now, I want to get back to this issue of a nuclear Israel. And, of course, Israel's out there screaming that they want a nuclear-free Middle East, which actually pretty much everybody else wants as well. And it always comes down to this sticking point. If Israel wants a nuclear-free Middle East, let's start with the one nation that we all know already has nuclear weapons, Israel. And, of course, Israel, no, we got to keep ours. We want you to not have nuclear weapons, but we're exceptional. We're above international law. Our nuclear weapons are blessed by God. We have to keep them. They're holy, sacrosanct, whatever. Now, speaking of Manhattan, last Sunday, there was a very large protest march against nuclear weapons. And it stretched 12 city blocks and at least 5,000 people. Marchers from all over the United States. There was international participation against nuclear weapons. Not a single U.S. corporate media outlet gave them any coverage whatsoever. You only heard about it because it's here on the independent media. And then the corporate media wonders why single digits of young people trust them these days here. Now, here's a very telling and sadly inevitable article we're seeing in antiwar.com. The U.S. military is going to administratively split the Kurdish region and the Sunni militias as a separate country in Iraq in order to basically get around restrictions on just who is getting the U.S. military aid. And House Republicans are going to declare Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as the regions held by the Sunni Arab militias, as countries of their own for the sake of aid shipments. Now, this makes all these smaller countries, Kurdistan, Sunnistan, and the reduced Iraq, much easier for the U.S. to meddle in. And that's actually been on both the U.S. and Israeli agenda all along for Iraq. Take a regional rival for Israel, break it into little tiny pieces, make it easy to manage, easy to control. And, of course, that's also the plan for Iran. So this is the first step. Now, speaking of Marco Rubio, he has waded into this Iran deal, the P5+1. And he is adding an amendment that says there will be no deal unless Iran makes an explicit public endorsement that Israel is the Jewish state. This has nothing whatsoever to do with Iran's nuclear technology or the economic sanctions. Marco Rubio is simply obeying his Israeli masters to go on in there and push Israel's agenda and to find a way to kill the deal, which is really what this is. This is the silver bullet that will kill the deal. And I want you all to remember this as Marco Rubio gets up there on those podiums and swears that he will serve the United States of America and the American people. That's certainly not been his past record. Meanwhile, Iran just announced they have broken their oil export record. They've exported 7 million barrels of oil in a single day from one of their southern terminals. What does that tell us? It tells us the economic sanctions against Iran are working no better than the economic sanctions against Russia, because Iran and Russia just turn to the rest of the world and do business with them. These sanctions come back and they hurt American businesses who used to do business with Iran and used to do business with Russia. We're already seeing Europe begin to fragment over the Russian sanctions, and they're all saying, enough of these U.S. sanctions things. We got to do business. And it's not working. Iran is doing very well without commerce from the United States. So is Russia. And it is a reminder that the United States of America and Wall Street is not the center of the global financial system any longer. And if they keep making policy as if they are, they're only going to accelerate the collapse. Now, interesting article over at Money as Debt. There is now a movement in Great Britain demanding the British government issue through its treasury debt-free, interest-free money as it used to do back in 1914, the Bradbury pound. And what this tells us is the people of Great Britain, like the people of Canada, and like the people of the United States of America, are starting to realize what a scam this private central banking model is and how it has been imposed on us by the greed of the money junkies and the complicity of the Congress, the finest Congress money can buy. And unfortunately, the bankers have got all the money to do it. But they're beginning to realize what private central banking is not about the nation and its people. The private central banks exist to predate on us, to make themselves trillionaires at our expense. And they get away with it because members of the government, whether it's Parliament or the Congress, would sell their own mothers for $1. All righty. Let's see. I see a phone call waiting on the line, but we're coming up on a commercial break. So, Steve in Florida, I'm going to hold you over until after we come back from the commercials. We'll talk to you then. By the way, Russia has now seized the Russian assets of Poroshenko's chocolate factory. He had promised to sell it when he became president of Kiev. He didn't, so Russia has now seized it. I'm sure that's going to get things going in Ukraine. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and we're going to go right on back to Steve in Florida. Aloha, Steve. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mikey. I'm having trouble understanding something. I hope you can help me out with that. This has to do with Hillary's emails. Okay, she broke the law and used her own service or server, and okay, and then she erased them all and said whatever. We know what happened. Okay. But, okay, my question is like, okay, say you send me an email. Okay, I have a copy of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you could erase the fact that you sent it to me, but I still have a copy. I mean, is the nature of that you can erase the email that you sent, off of my computer?
No, that's absolutely correct here. Those emails may well have been saved and archived in other locations, and we're actually hearing...
Right, so she sent them to whomever she sent them to, because I think it's just a matter of time before some of these people start coming forward and saying, okay, this is what I got from Hillary.
Well, here's the question I think we all need to be asking. If the NSA is really able to monitor all of our email, they have to have copies of all of Hillary's emails. Yeah. They should have had copies of all of Lois Lerner's emails. So maybe these giant data centers they've been building all over the country are just empty warehouses, and it's all a gigantic bluff to try and discourage us from talking with each other, which obviously has not worked.
Well, I think that's pretty much right, Mike. I think it's all just to make us afraid.
Well, now, getting on back to Hillary's email, her campaign is taking the position that technically she didn't break the law didn't exist when she got the server, ex post facto is outlawed. But I think for the American voter, what they have to look at is somebody who very clearly was playing recklessly, fast and loose with U.S. government taxpayer property, which are what all those emails are. In the course of her doing her job as Secretary of State, all those communications are the property of the American people. And, basically she's guilty of what Petraeus was, just reckless handling and careless handling of these classified information. It's pretty much confirmed her server was wide open to hacking. And so I don't think we need to waste time on whether or not it was actually illegal. It was a stupid and reckless thing to do, and basically shows, that Hillary Clinton is obsessed with secrecy away from the government, if not foreign powers. And on that basis alone, this is something that I hope would come back and haunt her as she mounts her campaign.
Right. Well, Hillary is above the law,
Not in my book.
Not mine either. But I don't want somebody that's above the law. Well, look at Obama.
There shouldn't be anybody above the law. That was the whole point of the Constitution, that nobody was above the law. Everybody, from the bricklayer on up to the president, have to comply with the law, or they're going to basically face the consequences. Now, we've lost that as we have descended into a fascist economic dictatorship. We do have people who are so wealthy that they can get away literally with murder, and that is not healthy for society as a whole.
Yeah. Well, she's acting like Israel, like the laws apply to everybody except her.
Well, it's not Israel. Every fascist government has had the same idea. The laws are just for the little people, to keep the slaves in place.
Right.
We're the nobility, and because we are nobility, the laws do not apply to us, which actually used to be the case. I mean, when you go back and you look at the case of Elizabeth Bathory, they literally had to change the law to allow her to be prosecuted for the mass murders and tortures that she'd been carrying out, because technically under the law it was legal for her to do that. It just was such bad public relations that they finally had to say, yeah, we've got to be able to prosecute nobility, for just murdering innocent young people just for the joy of it. And then they basically walled her up in her own castle until she died of old age.
Right. But at this point, what does it matter?
Thank you, Hillary. All right, we're going to let you go here, Steve, and I got to get back onto a bunch of news stuff here. Now, one of the things that is going on that we are not seeing be reported on the corporate media are these two massive trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and, of course, Obama has come under a lot of criticism. And his response is, well, what do you think is wrong with this? Which is easy for him to say because these trade agreements are classified away from the American people. And it gets even better. Under the law, Congress is allowed to look at these trade documents as they're being negotiated. But Obama has issued an executive order that the Congress, your elected representatives, may not share what they see in those documents with you. And obviously, with that much secrecy on the documents, these are not being put together to benefit the American people and the American nation. A lot of people are very concerned about a transfer of sovereign legal authority away from the government to corporations, rise of the corporate state. We already know there are draconian copyright protections in there, intellectual property protections that are going to limit communication on the Internet. We know there are bans on GMO labeling inside these trade agreements, and as of last report, there is a prohibition against allowing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement inside the borders of any country that signs these. And opposition to these trade agreements is continuing to grow, and what we're hearing from a lot of the people is that these trade agreements are basically outdated. They're something that would have made sense in the middle of the last century, but they're really outdated and unsound policies, but they're being rammed through to basically reward corporate donors to the current political structure. And basically what those who have seen these documents and are leaking are that these documents embody the very worst provisions of previous trade agreements, which means it's going to take more jobs away from Americans. It's going to further erode our standard of living as part of the globalist agenda that we all be driven down to squalor so they can safely lower all the borders. Now, we're looking at another article over in Op-Ed News about this fast-track process is flouting the Constitution because these are full formal treaties that require the review and ratification of the United States Senate. And this so-called fast-track authority is where the Senate simply abandons its oversight and says, whatever you sign is okay with us. And, I mean, there are 500 corporate lobbyists inside the Trans-Pacific Partner negotiations, and the public is being kept in the dark. Senator Warren has come on out saying that it's illegal for the press to review the text of the agreement. And she's out there saying, yeah, Congress can see it. They can't share it with you. Obviously, this is not being passed for your benefit, and that's why the corporate media is ignoring it. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Here we're talking about the economy. Now, we're hearing from the United States Labor Department that they are not going to investigate allegations that Southern California Edison abused the H-1B visa program to bring in skilled foreign workers ahead of U.S. job candidates. And the Labor Department is saying the reason they're not going to investigate is because they never received a complaint from anyone directly and adversely affected by the H-1B visas. Well, it's very, very hard. If you've gone up to Southern California Edison and you've applied for a job and you've been refused, there's no way for you to know it's because they got an H-1B visa person in there. Now, there are two issues at work here. The first is these people coming in on the H-1B visas are willing to work for lower salaries than most Americans. They're not carrying the huge debt load. They're, in many cases, not subject to the same high taxes. The other part of it has to do with the decay of the U.S. educational system, particularly since the advent of Common Core, where our children are not being educated. They're being indoctrinated. They're being taught to believe as they're told to believe. And they are pointedly not being taught analytical, scientific, problem-solving skills. Because the ability to analyze, think for yourself, and solve problems makes you dangerous to the political establishment. And so we have a generation of young people who've been taught to be consumers, users of debt, obedient slaves and soldiers, but they lack the skills needed for high technology, and that's why so many American companies are going to the H-1B visa program to bring in people with technical skills from other countries. Now, here's a story that really makes me very angry. This was over at the Huffington Post. House Republicans are now pushing legislation to end predatory lending protections for American soldiers. This is something the banking lobby wants because predatory lending is a big money maker. And by the way, it's open season on you. Payday loans, all the rest of that stuff. Legalized loan sharking is out there. It's widespread. Now, apparently, because so many of these soldiers, when they are overseas, their families staying behind, fall victims to these predatory loans, there was a legal protection saying, look, these people are out there fighting our wars of conquest for you, the money junkie, so hands off. And you'd think that might be something the money junkies would be agreeable to. But apparently not. And so now there's a provision that is in the current National Defense Authorization Act, which removes the laws shielding military families from abusive terms on payday loans and other high-interest credit. So go on out and fight for the money junkies, and we're still going to put the screws to your family back home. I mean, that is obscene. Now, obviously, we understand. We live at a time where the entire economy is being held up by allowing the bankers to prey on us, to take our savings accounts, to charge high interest, to play whatever games they need to stay solvent, because that's the only thing holding it all together. But for them to send our young people out to these foreign countries to try and conquer them and bring them into the blessings of private central banking, Bretton Woods, the petrodollar, and then turn around at the same time and allow those same bankers who are profiting from those wars to go on out and play their little loan sharking games on the families of these people in uniform. That is absolutely, absolutely shameful. And members of Congress ought to be ashamed of even considering it, no matter how much the banking lobby is pushing for it. But I have come to understand that one of the prerequisites for government service in Washington, D.C. is that you have to have your sense of shame and morality surgically removed before your first day of work. All righty. Now, here's an editorial that appeared over in Review Journal. And they're talking about what's going on in Nevada with the school testing meltdown system. The editorial's out there saying, well, really, the state of Nevada has to shoulder the blame for this. Here's what's going on. As you know, most of Common Core is all about constant standardized testing and getting kids ready to pass those tests, which is not the same thing as having an education. They're just really good at taking tests. But over in Clark County, they halted the examinations because all of these standardized tests are now being done over the Internet on computers. And they are coming out of hubs like at UCLA's Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and the New Hampshire-based Measured Progress. And apparently the computer systems are up to the usual standards that we see today from American-developed software. In other words, they're crashing all the time. They never really worked properly to begin with. The wrong answer is being assigned to the wrong question. They're not getting reliable data out of there. They're just going through the motions to say, see, we're complying with the standardized testing. And at the time when the Clark County District simply gave up trying to use it, students couldn't even log into the testing server. It was that badly botched. Must have been built by the same people who made the Obamacare website. And so now the Common Core people are saying, well, really, it's the state's fault here. We're perfect. We're Common Core. We're absolutely perfect. And Common Core is turning out to be as much of a disaster as Obamacare. And it's certainly not educating our kids. There was an article we posted to whatreallyhappened.com regarding a parent's answer to a scolding note they got from the administration of the school where their child is attending school, because the parents took the child with them for 3 days on a trip to Boston. And they made a point while there of touring the Freedom Mile, visiting the graves of some of the founding fathers. Very educational in my mind. So let's a kid experience this stuff. But they got a very scolding note from the school saying, we're going to send our truancy enforcement officer around if there's any more of this nonsense going on. And what was really absurd was the parents had notified the school ahead of time. We will be taking our child with us on a trip for 3 days. And please give them the schoolwork in advance. And the reply they got from the school is, well, we can't judge the educational value of this trip, and therefore, we don't agree that you should take your child. Well, first of all, it shouldn't be up to the school. But we're seeing as part of this Common Core how schools are intruding more and more into the students' private lives. What medications are in your parents' medicine chest? Do your parents talk about medical marijuana? Do your parents have guns? And it's not any of the school's business. They're basically doing that old Nazi thing of trying to get the kids to snitch on the parents. And what it all comes down to is these days all of the school's fundings are based on how many students for how many days. Every day a student is out of class for whatever reason, they lose money. And that's why they're taking this hard line. Your child will be here, even if we're not educating them, because we get money when your child is here. And so the parent wrote back a note saying, I think my child is better educated with us going out into the real world than sitting there plugged into a Common Core testing computer system that, let's be honest, based on that situation in Nevada, it's not working anyway. We used to have a friend that lived here on Oahu. They have now since gone back to the mainland. They were working with the local Common Core company, and some of the stories they were telling us about double billing the Department of Education. It's just a gigantic scam. It's not really providing an education to children. It's basically a big lie. They're convincing our children they have an education, even as it keeps them dumbed down and unable to think clearly. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're coming up on the top of the hour and the news break here. I want to step back to the economy just a little bit and ask all of you listening, do you have an extra $50,000 lying around that's otherwise not needed? Probably the answer is going to be no. And the numbers are now in. Over his first term in office, the first 4 years, Barack Obama has increased the debt of every single American household by $50,521. That is the increase in the U.S. government debt amortized across the population. And it should anger you greatly because back in 2009, Obama was out there promising he was never going to sign a bill that added a dime to the deficit. And yet the debt of the federal government has increased by $5.8 trillion with a T, which is more than all of the debt accumulated from George Washington through Bill Clinton. And I imagine probably a lot of you are feeling like King Sisyphus, trying to push that rock up to the top of the mountain, and you can never actually get it there. Because it should be obvious to anybody, it doesn't matter how much you sacrifice. It doesn't matter how much austerity you endure. It doesn't matter how much taxes you pay. The system is set up to always keep you a slave to debt. Slavery does not sit well with me, and I don't think it sits well with you. It shouldn't. If you're happy being a slave, well, what are you listening to this program for? Now then, back to the world of computers. Apparently, American Airlines has a system to provide their flight crews with information over networked iPads. And apparently, several dozen flights were effectively grounded, couldn't leave the gate because the system crashed. And the iPads being held by the pilots and co-pilots simply shut off. And it sort of reminds you, sometimes paper really is the superior solution here. But here's the point I want to make. When Rome was at its peak, it accomplished amazing works of engineering. The aqueducts, roads, viniculture, medicine, all of that stuff. Tremendous advance in civilization. When Rome became crippled with debt and could not afford to maintain their own technologies any longer, Rome began to fall. The aqueducts wouldn't deliver water. The medicines didn't work. We're seeing a repeat of that right now. I'm old enough to remember when computers in the home first came out. Radical idea. We were all considered nerds, dweebs. You know, we were the odd people out. We had computers in our home. Wow, what are they doing with the computers? We're playing Rogue and Pong and all the rest of that. Today, they've become an indispensable part of everyday life. We are dependent on them. And because of the early laws that were put in place to indemnify computer hardware and software makers from litigation arising from defective products, we have products which are not reliable. We see that all the time. The blue screen of death. This machine here on my desk is less than a year old. We had a lockup on it the other day. Nobody is trying to rein in all the cyber criminals. Apparently, according to one security outfit, some of the cyber criminals are working for the NSA, just making a little money on the side or something like that. It's one thing to tolerate less than reliable products that are peripheral to your life. But our entire society is now dependent on them, and we are not treating the computer system as critical infrastructure. It's a marketing opportunity. It's a tool for the government to spy on us in violation of the 4th, 5th, 9th, and 10th Amendments. But we're not treating it like something that ought to be made reliable and dependable, as seen by the situation with American Airlines iPads and this story out of Nevada with the Common Core testing, or the Obamacare website. We have all these ambitious computer systems that don't really seem to work. F-35 is another example. They can't get that system to work. We may have reached a point of allowing these systems to become too complicated to actually maintain and repair any longer. And that is something our nation can't afford. In fact, if we're going to have any chance to halt the decline and fall of the American empire and regain a healthy economy, we have to bring back product liability, and not just to computers, hardware, and software, to vaccines, to GMO products. Product liability was the natural mechanism to incentivize corporations to produce quality products. And under our current fascist system, corporations are incentivized to put out the cheapest product they can and say, well, you know, if it fails, we're not responsible for your loss of data. You can just come and get a replacement for whatever failed, and do that again and do that again. I remember when we were first setting up our animation shop, back when Carly Fiorina was in charge of Hewlett-Packard, and they were getting their CD-ROM drives from a company in Hungary, which does not exactly have a reputation for high-tech, and they were failing after 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks, I'd have to go down to CompUSA and swap out another drive, taking time away from doing what I got paid to do. And the losses to American productivity of these fragile computer systems are too large to ignore any longer. I would rather deal with a lot less of the bells and whistles and the fancy screens and animated wipes and all the rest of that stuff, to have something that I know for a fact I'll be able to walk in, flip on the switch, and get some productive work done. I still, to this date, have not been able to install my legally licensed cut of 3D Studio Max on my Windows 7 machine, and nobody seems to have an answer how to make it work. If I'd actually been dependent on that piece of software for my business, I'd be out of business by now. And I would not be able to sue the computer software company under our current laws. All righty, let's see. Now, first Detroit was shutting off water to their citizens because water is not a natural human right. You will pay for it. And now they're starting to do it in Baltimore. There's been a protest about that. I can talk about bad timing. They've already got protests in the street over police brutality, and now the city is starting to shut off water to hundreds of residents in Baltimore. None of the corporations that are behind on their water bills. They're getting a free pass. But there are some 20,000 residents in Baltimore who are looking at having the taps run dry. And coming right on top of all the upset over the police brutality, I would think somebody in the Baltimore government might want to step back and say, let's hold off on the water shutoffs for a few weeks anyway. Now, getting on back to Hillary, apparently Reuters investigated and found that the Clinton family charities have had what they call a Geithner moment. They failed to report tens of millions of dollars in contributions from foreign governments on tax documents. And now they're going back and saying, it was a mistake, really, shoulda, coulda, woulda, it's a mistake, we're going to refile the taxes. But apparently, Goldman paid Bill Clinton $200,000 for a speech just at the same time they started lobbying Hillary regarding the Export-Import Bank. And, of course, Hillary's campaign is, you can't legally prove anything. It's all implied. Well, I have a message for Hillary Rodham Clinton's campaign. Politics is perception. The voting booth is not a court of law, and legalistic games aren't going to get a lot of traction. The sheer volume of wrongdoing looks bad. And in politics, in that voting booth, what looks bad is bad. Another article here about Clinton Foundation failed to disclose 1,100 foreign donations. And it's just all over the place. And it's all of the scandals together. This is somebody who has done anything to attain power. And if she gets the power of the White House, count on her to do anything she wants with it. And that is the real danger. That's why Hillary cannot be allowed into the White House. She's absolutely willing to break all the rules, do whatever she thinks she can get away with. And there's a lot of dead bodies in the wake of the Clintons' rise to political stardom. A lot of ruined, destroyed lives. Mine is one of them. Got to take a break for the news. We'll be right back. Hello, hi, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. We're closely watching developments in Baltimore and also in Times Square. Very large crowds are starting to gather. It is peaceful. The crowds in Baltimore, the protest there is saying they will comply with the 10 p.m. curfew, and they're planning for their protest march to end at that point. Of course, if there are agent provocateurs present among the crowd trying to cause a ruckus, things could get very interesting again, everywhere where there's a protest going on. There were reports of violence in Chicago, but I've not yet been able to confirm those. Getting on back to Hillary's campaign for president and politics being perception, we're now finding out that 181 donors to the Clinton Foundation were also engaged in lobbying Hillary's State Department. Now, it looks to me like there is a clear pattern of an attempt to curry favor with the Clintons through the foundation. And don't forget, when Hillary became Secretary of State, speaking fees for Bill Clinton quadrupled. And those speaking fees also go into the foundation. We now know that that foundation actually only donated about 10% of their proceeds to any real charitable work. The rest is being used to provide transportation, office rental, furniture. It's being described as a slush fund by independent groups that monitor nonprofit foundations for political corruption, money laundering. Alrighty, let's see. Getting on down here. This is kind of an interesting story. Again, going into the next election season, we're seeing politicians try and create and fan up fringe issues for you to get your knickers in a twist about, rather than have you asking embarrassing questions about the economy, the wars, why the U.S. government borrows out of thin air currency from the privately owned Federal Reserve at interest when the Constitution allows the U.S. government to make their own money, interest-free. They don't want you asking that. So there are women's rights, the rape crisis, and, of course, the gay hysteria. And apparently over in North Dakota, State Representative Randy Boning, very unfortunate name there, he is basically anti-gay in his public face and politics. And it turns out he himself has been outed by sending apparently unsolicited explicit photos of himself to other men through a gay dating application. And apparently one of the gay men who got the photos didn't appreciate the attention coming from somebody who in his public face is anti-gay and blew the lid off of that. Apparently there's been an unarmed 20-year-old shot up in Detroit, and apparently federal agents kicked down the door of a house involving a warrant from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And they just walked into this house, actually kicked down the door, and they shot this kid dead. Now, the official story is he had a hammer in his hand, and the officer involved feared for his life. The father is saying that they were doing some home repairs. And yeah, when you're doing home repairs, you have things in your hand like screwdrivers and hammers. And you would think after Baltimore, after all these others, that every other police department and government agency would be telling their officers, cool it with the guns, cool it with the tasers. But apparently not. And so now up in Detroit, they've got another one of these situations getting ready to explode. And the police are wrong. And that's illustrated by the fact that up in the city of Chicago, they're now having to make reparations to the victims of that hidden Chicago Police Department torture center where they were doing waterboarding and all the kinds of Abu Ghraib stuff to try and get confessions out of people that had been wrongfully arrested. And they're trying to work out a settlement. Mayor Rahm Emanuel is basically offering a $5.5 million reparations fund for the victims of the torture, which when you consider how many victims there are, that's not really a huge amount of money. And it has come out that this torture center was being operated for 2 decades by the Chicago Police Department. Part of the reparations include a permanent memorial to the victims of police torture, a formal apology from the city, and mandatory curriculum for 8th and 10th grade students in the public school systems will be taught about this case, that it actually happened for at least, a year, year and a half, 2 years. Now, over in Albuquerque, the district attorney, who has charged 2 of the Albuquerque police with the murder of that homeless camper, James Boyd, last year, has gone public that she is receiving death threats for challenging the police department. Yes, they committed murder. You're supposed to let them get away with that. And apparently insiders in the Albuquerque police force who are fed up with all this nonsense are letting her know she needs to be careful because some of the officers that were involved in that shooting or are friends of the officers who have been charged and are being brought to trial are out there saying they want to get rid of her. The police are out of control when they are out there threatening the district attorneys to let them go. Now, a former police officer from the Philadelphia Police Department testified in court yesterday and was in connection with another case of police abuse and basically told the jury that he and his fellow police officers lied, planted drugs, stole money from suspects more times than they could even count. That it's a common practice for the police to do this. Meanwhile, the district attorney over in Clark County is saying that the SWAT sniper from the 2014 shooting will not face charges because the person who was shot was clearly suicidal and they acted in the best interest of preserving the life of everybody around him. And this is another one of these cases where they're going to blame the victim. Oh, he did this wrong. He had a hammer in his hand. He was clearly suicidal, was committing suicide by police gunfire. They're doing it just to make us look bad. Now, the statistics are very clear. Right now, the American police forces are murdering 55 times as many innocent Americans as the terrorists are. And yet the police would have you believe that all of these murdered Americans somehow deserved to die, or they had an unknown medical condition, or they'd had surgery or some other excuse. They really are out of control. There's no accountability whatsoever. And again, I'm glad that so far the violence has not been all that great in Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, whatever. But let us not lose sight of the fact the people of the United States have a legitimate grievance. And we have a right to petition our government for redress of grievances. And if the government ignores that petition and refuses to redress the grievances, that's when things start escalating. Now, here's an interesting article that came out of Russia Insider, and they start out with a quote from Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the father of America's nuclear navy. And he was testifying before the U.S. Senate back in the 1970s, and he was asked, how long would the U.S. aircraft carriers survive in a war against the Russian Navy? And Admiral Rickover said, maybe 2 or 3 days before they sunk. Maybe a week if they stay in harbor. This, of course, was not what the Senate wanted to hear. But America's reputation for military invincibility is based on the fact that we go after countries that are far, far weaker than we are. And the idea that we might not actually be able to hold our own in a war against Russia or China is something that we have to take seriously under consideration. More about that when we come back. Oh, hi, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're asking the question, for all the money that has been spent by the U.S. government on the machinery of mass death, how would we actually fare against a peer? Yes, we have all these weapons where we can go into a country like Iraq or Libya or Syria and just bomb the heck out of them because they're basically helpless. How would we fare against an equally matched nation? And the prognostications are not very good. See, here in the United States of America, defense contractors are about making money, and members of Congress who vote the contracts to the defense contractors are all about getting their piece of the action as a campaign donation or other means. And that's why America's weapons are so hideously expensive, bloated with gadgets, and not very effective. But the people who are making America's war policy are planning that war based on the sales brochures coming from the defense contractors about what these weapons can and will do, and they always come up short. We know that a lot of the testing that is done to validate weapon systems are basically rigged. Locator beacons on the target telling the crews where and when to expect the attack to be intercepted. These are courtesies that we're not going to get from a real enemy. And so even back in the 1970s, Admiral Hyman G. Rickover told the U.S. Senate that in a war against Russia or China, the life expectancy of our carrier battle groups is 2 or 3 days. Now, the actual weakness of our military forces has been hammered home by 2 recent incidents. The first involved the USS Donald Cook, an Aegis ship, which in theory can detect, track, and engage 90 aerial targets simultaneously. Few more, few less, depending upon the particular configuration. And the Donald Cook was completely paralyzed by the electronic warfare systems of a single Russian aircraft. Now, the Aegis ships are the main air defense system for a carrier battle group. If those get shut down by electronic warfare, the enemy missiles are going to find their main target, which is the carrier itself. And there was another little embarrassment involving the USS Chancellorsville, which was put out of commission for 6 months and suffered $30 million in damage by being hit by one of its own drones. Now, the second incident happened out in the Atlantic during war games, in which the French submarine Saphir succeeded in penetrating a carrier battle group centered on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and succeeded in sinking, in terms of the simulation, not only the carrier itself, but several of the screening ships without being detected, not even by the Los Angeles-class fast attack sub that was part of the defensive screen. And this is the situation the U.S. finds itself in. It's got all the problems with the Independence-class littoral combat ships, underarmed, under-armored, electronics wide open to jamming, same as the Donald Cook. All of our naval ships are too dependent on active defense, and they're very thin-skinned. F-22 still asphyxiating its pilots. F-35, huge list of problems on that one. Now they're admitting the engines aren't reliable, which we already knew from their habit of self-immolating on takeoff. The U.S. government has produced an array of visually impressive, very expensive weapons, but they don't live up to their sales brochure, and they are as out of touch with the current reality of naval warfare, which is very dependent on submarines, as the traditional battleships were in World War II. The U.S. went into World War II absolutely convinced the aircraft carrier was just a fringe little ship. They didn't need to worry about it. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor certainly showed them the error of their ways. And now the U.S. has settled on the carrier as the primary projector of power, and it works very well against countries who don't have equivalent weapons. But even though the United States spends more on the Defense Department than the next 26 nations combined, 25 of whom are supposed to be allies, that overspending doesn't guarantee victory. And anybody who thinks it does, that we're going to win because we can shovel the money into the fire faster than the other guy, they're deluded. The U.S. may have produced a huge flotilla of basically junk, and they're bluffing with it. They're bluffing around the world. Do what we say or we'll send our Death Star to get you. Now, the Missile Defense Agency has wasted, apparently, an estimated $10 billion, with a B, on 4 projects that are officially canceled but still being spent on, maintained. One of them is the sea-based X-band radar, which I can see from out that window down there. It's sort of become a permanent fixture in Pearl Harbor. That thing cost $2.2 billion. And they're saying it's got problems, fundamental design problems that keep it from working. But they're still working on it. We see them hauling things up and down on the crane. The airborne laser in the Boeing 747, that never worked out because of thermal blooming. They basically $5.3 billion in, and their attitude was, well, we know that thermal blooming is going to be an issue, but if we spend enough money, we'll solve it. And they never did. The Kinetic Energy Interceptor, 6 years of development, $1.7 billion. It's of negligible utility. And then there was the multiple kill vehicle and all these other things. And again, supposedly, the movie The Pentagon Wars is out in its entirety on YouTube, or at least it was last week. And you should see it. It's a funny movie. It's an enjoyable film, and it's based on the true story, loosely, of the development of the Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle. And it really does underscore that military procurement, let me try that again, military procurement in the United States is all about money, getting more money from the taxpayers and spending it on defense contractors who reward their supporters with wonderful paying jobs, after they retire from military service, and they double dip with their pensions, and they make huge amounts of money. And what they're producing is kind of junk, because they're all hoping in their heart of hearts they're not really going to go to war anyway, right? So we can make this thing that looks impressive, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't really matter as long as it passes the testing. Apparently, an aerial tanker from the United States suffered an emergency over the English Channel, fell off the radar scopes, but did land safely back on its base. No details as to exactly what happened with it. The Air Force is out there still pushing for its replacement for the A-10, and they're saying if Congress forces the Air Force to stay with the A-10, they're going to start trashing perfectly working F-16s, just to show that they're in control of the weapons procurement. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, as they mentioned on the SRN news break, Wall Street has decided to explain away the slowdown in the U.S. economy by blaming it on the last winter. And it's all over the media. I'm looking at an article came out of the Washington Post. Historically harsh winter weather slowed U.S. economic growth substantially. And they're out there basically saying because of the cold weather, consumer spending took a nosedive. Well, if you think about that for a minute, common sense is going to tell you not necessarily. Consumer spending might change their buying patterns. They're not going to be buying DVDs and barbecue sets, but obviously in the harsh weather, they needed to buy more snow tires, blankets. They certainly spent a lot more for their gas and electric to keep their homes warm. Consumer spending slowed because we are out of money, and they don't want to admit that because every night they go to bed dreaming that there are still vast amounts of untapped wealth out here in the hinterland, and all they have to do is figure out a way to scam it out of us, and they'll save not the economy, but at least their own particular stock portfolio. But they're going to blame the harsh winter for it. And here's where it gets weird, because we're seeing a fist fight come out between Wall Street and Al Gore's people. Because even as we're being told that the harsh winter is why the economy has stalled, and by the way, the Federal Reserve has just downgraded the U.S. debt rating, which means they can now charge higher interest on the debt, exacerbating the situation. We're hearing from Al Gore and the carbon Nazis that March was the hottest March on record, and April is shaping up to be exactly the same. So if you are a loyal, patriotic American, you will remember that it was a hard, cold winter when you're hearing the economic news, and you will forget all about that, and you will believe that March and April were record-high temperatures when it comes time to demand a carbon tax from you. Understand how it works now? Meanwhile, up in Nova Scotia, their agriculture and aquaculture took it in the teeth from the cold winter. And the insurance carriers in Nova Scotia are being just hammered by claims for losses due to the cold. Frozen livestock, frozen agriculture, fish freezing in the fish farms. And by the way, as we mentioned yesterday, it did actually happen. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, yesterday they set a record for the all-time lowest high temperature. And this was at the airport, surrounded by all these jets belching out burning fuel. It hit 59 degrees. The previous mark was 61 degrees in 1932. But you will believe Al Gore when they tell you global warming is real, it's all your fault. Now, there's another article out here from SOT.net. Global warming propagandists make breathtaking adjustments to Arctic temperature record. And not just the Arctic temperature record. This is all coming out of the revelation from Paul Homewood, who noticed that the Paraguay temperature records were very different from the raw data to the final adjusted official for consumption versions released to the public, because the raw data showed a temperature decline, getting colder, and after it had gone through NOAA and NASA's adjustments, it showed a temperature increase. And now, of course, NOAA and NASA are out there trying to defend that these adjustments are valid, they're necessary, we're correcting for temperature indicators that may not be accurate, we have to bring in these other factors. And it changed the results by as much as 30% in some cases. That's not an adjustment, that's a rigging. Now, some elements of the global warming cult are realizing they can't go on pushing global warming much longer. They're trying to already shift to ocean acidification. That's why we have to tax carbon. Ocean acidification. Forget about warming and cooling and all that other stuff. That's so last year. Now it's ocean acidification. And they're looking at the Arctic ice, which is still there. It's growing, contrary to Al Gore's prediction that last summer would see an ice-free Arctic. And they're not even trying to say the same thing for this summer here. And what they're basically backing off, Scripps Institute of Oceanography is saying, well, the computer models that we were using that said the Arctic would be ice-free were based on, oversimplified arguments. And we're building new models that are saying the Arctic ice is coming back. The oversimplified arguments for the original models basically came down to the argument, tell everyone the Arctic will be ice-free or you lose your funding. And all joking aside, this illustrates the problem with the Carbonazzi claim that computer models prove human-caused global warming. Computer models cannot prove anything. All a computer model does is forecast the outcome of the initial assumptions programmed into them. If the assumptions are wrong or do not include all possible factors, as they're now admitting was the case, the results of the computer run won't match what's going on in the real world. It'll just say, this is what my theory says will happen if there are no other outside factors. Garbage in, garbage out. And that's exactly what happened. None of the computer models used by Al Gore and his global warming cult accounted for variations in solar activity. No climate model can account for the volcanic activity on the floors of the world's oceans because nobody knows how many active volcanoes and thermal vents are down there. Even on land, the known volcanoes can behave unexpectedly, such as the sudden activity at Calbuco in Chile, and even here in Hawaii, Kilauea is showing an unusual surge in activity. Every computer model uses a limited set of assumptions, and the universal assumption that no other factors will influence the outcome, and that's why they keep coming up short. And yet these computer models are being wagged at you to convince you that the world has been getting warmer and it's all your fault, even though very clearly that is not what's going on. Alrighty, let's see. I want to talk about Chernobyl. As you heard it on the SRN news break, and we're getting a bunch of conflicting claims. The Kiev officials are saying it's not a problem, don't worry about it, everything's going to be fine. The environmentalists are saying, are you out of your mind? Last report I have from the area, the fires are only 3 miles away from the pits where the spent fuel rods are stored. Now, right now, Kiev is saying that the wood that's burning up isn't all that radioactive, and therefore you shouldn't worry about it, and maybe they're right. Although because of bioaccumulation, we know that plant matter tends to suck up radioactive isotopes. But if those fires ignite the spent fuel rods, that will be a disaster even worse than Fukushima. I'm sure TEPCO and GE and Japan will be saying, whoo, we got out of that one. Russia's the bad guy now for the nuclear disaster. But it is a major problem, and apparently because Kiev has spent all of their civic resources on these wars, they don't have the resources to try and actually deal with this. So we're going to be keeping an eye on that. I'll probably go back to daily radiation monitoring, because what we learned from the first Chernobyl and from 3 Mile Island and from Fukushima is when one of these nuclear disasters happens, they're going to lie about it. Maybe they'll get Ann Coulter to come back and say, a little radiation's actually good for you. All right. And it's not just Fukushima. Over in St. Louis, they're still dealing with the legacy of a radioactive accident, contamination they suffered years ago. More about that when we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we're talking about these people who are living in St. Louis in one of the suburbs. And the story focuses on the sudden revelation that a lot of them were suffering from lupus. Now, this is a condition that causes your immune system to turn on your own body, attacking healthy joint and organ tissues. It's similar to arthritis, or what's the other one that attacks the skin, and psoriasis. And so all of a sudden people started scratching their head about what's going on. Well, it's recently been determined that lupus can result for exposure to radioactivity. And so all of a sudden all these people are realizing they all grew up in a neighborhood next to a suburban St. Louis creek that had been contaminated with nuclear weapons waste for decades before they tried to clean it up. And even though there was a cleanup, they're saying there could still be radioactive waste in the creek, which springtime will flood parks, businesses, and neighborhoods, and there's never any testing for radioactivity. And these places are allowed to stay open with no public notification of the risks. And the reason this happened is back during the run-up to the Cold War, when America was building nuclear bombs wherever they could. The contracts were being spread all over the country into every state. And most of the people living in those states were not told what was going on in these buildings, in the industrial areas, where they were processing radioactive materials. And all of these facilities left behind huge piles of radioactive waste, contaminating the ground. There were 79 of these sites in New York State alone, 57 in Ohio, 48 in Pennsylvania, 38 in Illinois, 37 in New Jersey, 24 in Massachusetts, 22 in California. I could go on down the list here, but we know about the really bad ones like Hanford and the WIP facility. And a lot of these sites have not been fully cleaned up. The attitude is, if you don't know about it, who cares? If you get cancer, it stimulates the economy because then you have to go give your money to the Cancer Treatment Centers of America or the lupus or whatever all else is out there. Our government and our corporate media do not have a wonderful track record of keeping the public fully informed about these leftovers from war. And the attitude from the government has always been, we must prepare for war, and any side effects, well, that's just the cost of doing business, and the American people should just accept that. It's like all those soldiers who were marched into the aftermath of a nuclear blast in Nevada to see if the Army could actually exploit a breach in the enemy lines by a tactical nuclear weapon. And the vast majority of those soldiers spent the rest of their life battling cancers and leukemia, and the government denied all responsibility, saying, hey, these things happen when you're in the military service, and we're not responsible. Just like they denied any responsibility for Gulf War syndrome. Said it was all they're making it up. It's their imagination. And years later, they're saying that, yeah, they were exposed to biological weapons, and we're still not going to pay the bills. But they're out there ready to sell you vaccines, and there's a very interesting article over in hangthebankers.com, where they're talking about how down in Australia, Prime Minister Tony Abbott has signed on to this idea that the government gets to decide what medications you will be forced to take. And this article is pointing out that the main agenda is not public health, but because Tony Abbott is very good friends with Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch has strong financial connections with GlaxoSmithKline, which makes a huge amount of money selling vaccines, and they're paying out huge amounts of money in damage settlements. And Tony Abbott seems to be okay with forcing Australians to be shot full of vaccines that might actually cause more harm than good, because his buddy Rupert Murdoch is going to make money off of it, and I'm sure Rupert Murdoch will be a financial supporter for Tony Abbott's future political career. Now, there's a little bit of good news from the vaccine front. Some years ago, back in 1998, The Lancet put out a paper raising the questions of a link between the MMR vaccine and the link to autism. And the author of that paper, Professor John Walker Smith, came under immediate attack by the orthodoxy, was actually lost his medical license under screams that his research was faulty, it was poorly supported. And he took it to court. And as of today, the British court threw out the conviction and completely exonerated the authors of the study. And so Walker Smith is now a fully licensed physician in the UK, although he's officially retired. But basically the judge looked at this, saying that the panel's determination that he was unfit to be a licensed physician cannot stand. It was based on inadequate, superficial reasoning and, in a number of instances, absolute wrong conclusions. And it's just a reminder that a lot of what you're being told about the safety and efficacy of certain products is bought and paid for advertising, wrapped in a white lab coat or a politician's three-piece suit. And then the corporate media wonders why we don't trust them. I still look back to that article that was on the National Geographic last month, their cover article, Why Don't People Trust Science? It is the essence of science you don't trust. You look for repeatability. You look for confirmation. You're always looking for ways to further refine the theory, not just say humans cause global warming, it's scientific, therefore you should believe. Because rulers, ages ago, would wrap whatever they wanted with convenient clergy. God says you should invade the Middle East for us. Well, not a lot of people are listening to clergy anymore. So now the new wrapper is science, a white laboratory coat. And they want us to trust anything a scientist says. And the whole point of the scientific method is that individual scientists make mistakes. They let their ambitions get the better of them. The whole idea of scientific method is that you should never trust anything a scientist says unless you can duplicate it for yourself. The mantle of science has been used to sell a lot of nonsensical stuff. You know, sugary sodas are good mid-morning nutrition. That kind of stuff. It's amazing. All right, Ebola apparently is still going strong in Liberia. They thought they were in control of it, but now they're seeing these other hot zones erupt up. They wanted to be Ebola-free by mid-February. That did not happen here. Speaking of volcanoes, kind of a weird story. Down in Kilauea, there's an inner crater, and there's a lake of lava down at the bottom of it, and it tends over time to go up and down. It is now at a record high level, to the point where it's starting to spill out across the wider floor of Kilauea itself. Needless to say, tourists are down there watching this thing. It's a spectacle. Obviously, Kilauea is increasing in activity. I noticed from the seismographic record there's a lot more small quakes happening down there as well. But apparently somebody decided he was going to fly this little 3-inch quadcopter toy with a camera out over the lake to take pictures. And as a result of that, the park rangers at the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park chased this guy down and tased him. And the people who were there all contacted local media saying, what the heck is going on? You know, that they basically just brutalized this guy for using a little 3-inch toy copter to try and get a picture of the lake. What harm was he doing? If he makes a mistake, his quadcopter flies into the lava and he loses it. We have hundreds of people standing at the edge of a lake of molten lava, and the U.S. government park rangers thought a 3-inch toy quadcopter was the problem. And even here, these people in federal uniforms are acting like thugs. And at least for those in federal uniforms, there's not much aloha left in the aloha state. Anyway, there's the music. Time for me to get out of here, get some animation work done, pay some bills. Please make a point. This is a call to Rivero's Rangers, and I know some of you have already done this. Thank you very much. Call your local talk radio stations. Ask them to consider carrying the programming from the Genesis Communication Network. We want to get out on as many AM and FM radio stations as we can before they stop including AM and FM radios in the new cars. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.